Hello, everybody. My name is Dr. Edward Perin. Thank you for joining me today on the Living Well show. If you can't tell already, it's just me today. I am not joined by my producer, Pablo Madrigal. He is traveling today, but I'm going to do my best to still provide some degree of a value today. Uh, Producer Pablo has done a lot of work in preparation for this episode and has read out or has written out a lot of questions for me to read. So I don't know if we're going to get a whole hour out of this episode, but I'm going to be answering whatever questions I can at this time. I do want to be able to tell you that we are sponsored officially. This episode is brought to you by the Hopewell Institute. The Hopewell Institute is an educational media company dedicated to advancing mental health, personal development, and lifelong learning. They help fund educational content like this, making it easier for thoughtful conversations and transformative ideas to reach the people who need them. If you believe in the value of lifelong learning and want to support projects like this one, please visit www.thehopewellinstitute.com. The Hopewell Institute, education that moves people forward. Uh, Now that that's out of the way, let's jump into our questions. Well, towards the end of our episode last week, Pablo had asked a question about the actual modalities of psychotherapy. And I mentioned psychodynamics or the psychodynamic approach to psychotherapy. Now, that doesn't really mean a lot to too many people. So I would like to define it. Psychodynamic means the scientific study of the interaction and interdependence of psychological variables at various levels of awareness. You've probably heard Freud's topographical model. He looks at the conscious, the preconscious, and the unconscious. Those are different levels of awareness. Now, that's his terminology. There are multiple levels of awareness. If we didn't sleep very well and we're tired, we're operating from a different level of awareness. If we're drunk, we're operating from different levels of awareness. The psychodynamic approach looks at what are the different levels of awareness, what is maybe just outside of our levels of awareness, and it is making contact with that produces change. Now, for lack of a better word, I'm going to use encounter to describe that. In this case, an encounter with a previously unknown or a part of ourselves that is outside of our awareness. It is by bringing that to our awareness that we end up experiencing this tension, and it is through that tension that new possibilities are formed. I've described that as the intersection of acceptance and change. But there is a turmoil, there is a tension that occurs during this encounter. And that's often when new possibilities really become apparent. It's really hard to lead people in there because we really don't know what the tension is going to be, let alone the outcome of the tension. And I think the differences in the different therapeutic approaches are in the process. How do we create that encounter, or how do we create the conditions for that encounter? How do we navigate that tension? And how do we create the freedom for the patient to go out and live with that new repertoire, with that new way of being in the world? The questions that Pablo has provided for me are in that line. At the end of the set, if I somehow can speak for a whole hour, I am going to take some questions from the audience. Um, if you're following me on X, please send a chat. If you are following us through YouTube and Twitch, the account is at Dr. Perin, at DoctorPerin. Ask a question, make a comment, and I'll be able to read it off to you. So I'm just going to jump into this. The first question I have is, can these meaningful encounters happen outside of therapy? First and foremost, yes. Psychotherapy is not the only place in which someone can have these transformative moments. Very often, when we talk about trauma or traumatic experiences, we are talking about moments in our life that have made us confront parts of ourselves or part of reality that we have not entirely developed the resources to process and manage. It is often when we are confronting that, when we are wrestling with it, that we create the options to interact with it differently. An example I was recently talking with a mentor about was arachnophobia, fear of spiders. There are lots of different ways in which that can be addressed in psychotherapy. One of the most popular and common approaches for phobias is an exposure therapy. If you're afraid of spiders, create the conditions in which you can be exposed to spiders in a safe environment. No one's throwing black widows or brown recluse spiders on you, but maybe a daddy long legs, maybe, something that is innocent and fine, have them crawl up and down your body while you're processing that fear reaction. So what you're actually doing in that moment is you are confronting a part of yourself. You're either you're confronting your fear response, your disgust response, or even you're confronting your relationship with your fight or flight response, your actual central nervous system firing. When we're wrestling with this, especially if we're doing something differently, the old behavior, we might flick the spider off, or we would get up, run, or leave the room. In this, with the therapist or the therapeutic environment, it's safe to confront that that intensity, that giant fear response. And it is through that encounter, through the confrontation with your alarm system, while it's freaking out, while we're experiencing that big fear response, we are developing a new relationship with that intensity. We believe that we can survive it, or we are even a sense empathizing with the spider, recognizing that its purpose isn't to attack us, to harm us, and to poison us. It creates a new reality, a surplus reality in which we can potentially live side by side with spiders without having that panic response. Now, again, not all spiders. I think it's probably a safe and accurate response to have a fear or disgust reflex if you see a brown recluse or a black widow spider. But most spiders that occupy our homes, basements, they whether or not you want to get them out of the home, it's different if you have that phobia, that fear response where suddenly you can't function or you can't think clearly. Let's see. Um, can you explain how an encounter is different from a regular conversation? Um, I really think the big difference between maybe a therapeutic encounter and a regular conversation is because it works within that tension system, that we actually have to be in an emotional state in order to confront or have an encounter. Uh, a lot of times people create these very comfortable conditions. They'll talk about psychotherapy, how they have this very warm therapist. Rogerian, person-centered approaches are a lot like this. Come as you are, talk about what you want to talk about. We're going to go at your speed. We're not going to do anything particularly difficult if you're not in the mood for it. Um, Sometimes those therapies fall flat because they're not challenging. They're not actually creating the conditions for somebody to have tension, to find a new way of operating, a new way of being. Um, I think that's the same thing that we see in just regular conversations. Regular conversations, if you're talking with your friend or you're talking with a lover, you're probably not trying to cause them stress. You're probably not trying to get them a little tilted so that they can have a more clear and deliberate relationship with their emotional life. Very often, we're creating the conditions for comfort, for safety. That's the social contract. I honestly think that that's the biggest difference for the regular conversation, and also one of the reasons why I think it's funny that people compare psychotherapy to friendship. I've joked before that therapy is a terrible way to treat a friend. I think it's because as a therapist, part of my job is to bring attention to the parts of your life that is causing you pain. often bringing attention to where you yourself may be contributing to that, especially if you're not entirely aware of what processes or parts of yourself are contributing to it. If I were doing that to my pals, they wouldn't invite me out to the barbecue. I wouldn't be I would not be a lot of fun at parties if I was thinking, "Hey, maybe some of that is your fault. I wonder how you're contributing to that." No, friends don't like that. The sort of unspoken contract between friends and family is that we support them. If they're fighting with their spouse, even if they're completely in the wrong, we're supposed to say, "Yeah, they're out of line. You don't deserve that." That is part of the contract of having a friendship. That's not psychotherapy. Psychotherapy is drawing attention to those open tension systems in ways that I just don't think a lot of people want in a regular conversation. Okay, here's a funny one. Does every therapy session need to include some sort of emotional breakthrough? Need is a strong word. I like to think I'm pretty good at my job, but even I don't have those big eureka moments every single hour that I do psychotherapy. Uh, Hollywood kind of jazzes that up a little bit. Typically, if you see psychotherapy in a movie or in a television show, all of the problems are solved by the end of the session, or they'll get one of those, oh my gosh, eureka moments. Now they happen. Don't get me wrong. They happen in therapy. They can even happen in therapy with regularity, but it's not something that happens every single session. It doesn't need to be in every session. Very often, what ends up happening is we're creating the conditions for that emotional breakthrough. The therapist is responsible for some degree of like a therapeutic temperature. If somebody comes into the therapeutic session too hot, too agitated, we need to cool them down a little bit so that they can express it or that they can process what's going on. If they come in a little bit too cold and calm, it's the therapist's responsibility to maybe warm it up a little bit more to get more of that tension, to get more of the emotional content out. There is a sweet spot where I think that you're tense just enough to process and get a new relationship, but not so tense that you shut down and you're unable to integrate the new information. Um, a lot of time therapy is creating the conditions to have that eureka moment so that when it happens, it's profound. Um, I was on a podcast recently where we were talking about the what's the Goodwill Hunting with um sorry, I'm blanking on names. Robin Williams. Robin Williams is the therapist, and the big important scene is when he goes to Will and he says it's not your fault, talking about all of the different housing, all of the foster families that he went to, and he says it's not your fault, and they have this big embrace and Will cries and it's this powerful breakthrough moment. But what really is important about that is that the conditions were created for that. Will Smith, or sorry, Robin Williams's therapist character created the conditions for safety, was able to develop a therapeutic relationship where Will trusted him. He also even used tactical self-disclosure to let Will know that he had similar experiences or that he also went through a lot of difficult times, so that when he gave this feedback, he was someone who spoke from a position of knowing. So if he had said that, "Hey, Will, it's not your fault," in their first meeting, it probably wouldn't have gone very far. It probably would not have penetrated his defenses. It might have bounced off, or he would have had Will would have had some comeback or slight or joke to flip it back on to Robin Williams's therapist character. Um, so this is a long way of answering, does every therapy session need to include some sort of emotional breakthrough? No, but there does need to be a process. The therapist does need to be working towards creating the conditions, putting the dominoes in place. So when there is a really potent transference or interpretation or a therapist-led encounter, it knocks it out of the park. It allows that intervention to be more potent, and timing is a very important aspect of that. Um, well, here's a question that's probably deeper than Pablo had in mind. Why do different therapy types work even though they use different methods? I think that's what I'm really trying to grasp here. That's what I'm really trying to be able to describe when I talk about the actual process of an encounter, the actual movement, the actual like the change that occurs in a therapy session. There are different ways to get there. Scientifically, psychotherapy works. We have a hypothesis, we test that hypothesis, and we adjust. And we can you can do a transference interpretation that way. It's fine. But beyond the scientific aspect of besides scientifically approaching psychotherapy to create that encounter, there's also an art to it. Some people are better at it than others. I can be kind of a brat on social media. I like to use provocation to elicit a response. That provocation is part of my art. That is part of the art to education and entertainment. If you provoke somebody, if you say something with no nuance or it's bold, they might be called to do their own homework or to research a subject in order to rebut or to provide that context. I had to I had to stir something in them for them to do their homework, to go into the material and study and do some education and come back. Part of that is by design. There are some people who aren't very provocative. They don't really have that ability to generate tension, to create thought, to create novelty, or to invite somebody to think differently. Um, there are some people who are maybe too provocative. I One of my favorite characters from the history of psychology and psychotherapy is Albert Ellis, the creator of REBT, Rational Emotive Behavior Therapy. You might have seen some of my memes about him. He used provocation and direct addressing of issues to create that tension. If you were to say something absurd like, "This is my only chance. I'll never have another shot." He might playfully say, "Because if you fail, you die. We'll take you to jail and you'll never have freedom ever again." And the person's going to say, "Whoa, whoa, whoa! It's not that bad. I just, I'll just stay unemployed longer, or I won't, talk to that girl at the bar." He did that by design because he would embellish or he would use hyperbole to make that person then readdress their statement. They might, dial back a little bit, but he used that technique artfully to create to have a person confront what they were saying or what they're thinking, to create a little bit more nuance or a little bit more specificity. It is that direct component that leads to an encounter. There are other ways to do that. Another one of my favorites, Fritz Perls, he used a technique called the empty chair technique. So he would invite a patient, let's say they're fighting with their spouse. He would invite that patient, "Okay, in this chair is your spouse. What's their name? What are they wearing? Tell me 3 things about them. Okay, go be that person. What do you have to say?" And he'll actually facilitate a conversation. Now, the mechanism of change there is they are confronting their fears, or they are confronting their version of in this case, their spouse. When they take the role of the spouse and they're able to use empathy and understanding and speaking from their perspective, they're taking the perspective of the other, and therefore they are healing. They're having more context to the argument. And so the therapist can stay back and doesn't have to say anything but, switch chairs, and they can have the whole confrontation, they can have the whole argument, but it'll create an emotional experience because they're living through their fear, or they're living through the tension that they think they're going to live through. Many different approaches can lead to many different types of encounter, But the one thing that you're going to see between an effective therapist and an ineffective therapist is they're going to be able to create that tension. I'm one of the biggest critics of manual-based psychotherapy because I think that's one of the things that these manuals really miss. They're impotent at creating that tension system. Now, if you read psychoeducational material, let's say it's PTSD and you're getting CBT for post-traumatic stress disorder, at some point in time, you're probably going to read about the biology of trauma. You're going to be reading about the fight or flight response, the central nervous system, what happens when you're triggered, what happens when you're calm. You can't be anxious and calm at the same time. So, if your sympathetic nervous system is firing, this is what, how to engage your parasympathetic nervous system. You read about it. It's neat. Maybe some of that information is going to be helpful and you're going to go, "Oh my gosh, I do that. That's what my body goes through." There is a degree of a confrontation there, but it's not very potent. It's not like you're well fed. It's kind of an appetizer. You go, "Okay, I can maybe integrate that. I can maybe understand that." Worksheets very similarly. They can make you confront your thoughts. They can make you challenge your beliefs, and sometimes it can be really tense, but in the absence of that interpersonal element, an actual other human, it's less potent. It's actually quite flimsy. We can see it with AI therapy as well. Like they can bring things to our attention. They might be able to make something unconscious conscious, but it's not really creating that tension, that therapeutic tension from an encounter. And if it does, I'm sure it may be able to do it someday. It's not as potent. It's not as effective. Um, I hope that answered the question. I tend to get a little long-winded on these things. Okay, yeah, I think I'm answering some of the subsequent questions inadvertently. So, for example, how does an encounter look different in, say, CBT versus psychodynamic therapy? And I think this is where the different modalities have different strengths and weaknesses. There are some modalities where their entire process is like, let's just get you into that tension system. You see that with a lot of the embodied therapies. You see it in like art therapy, dance and movement therapy, the empty chair technique in Gestalt therapy from Fritz Perls, or in psychodramatic encounters in the school of J.L. Moreno or Zerka Moreno. But if you will know that a therapy is effective if it is leading you to these tension systems, to these actual like confrontations. Um, Cognitive behavioral therapy is able to do that, but unless they're creating the conditions for that tension. The B, for example, I used exposure therapy as an example. I think that is one of the more useful approaches to cognitive behavioral therapy because it encourages you to confront the things that cause fear. If you're afraid of public speaking, great. Sign up for some public speaking classes, give some speeches, do an open mic night, sign up for an improv comedy class. You're going to be uncomfortable. You're going to put yourselves in the position of the thing that you fear, but because you're physically there and confronting these emotions, you're creating a version of yourself in which you can have that fear and do public speaking. So the approach to the encounter can look different. The encounter itself is the mechanism that makes something therapeutic, that makes something actually work, that leads to a change. And I say the intersection of acceptance and change. Accepting something is in many ways a change. And in fact, accepting something creates the space for a new relationship with that thing. That in itself is a change. Um, is uncovering a core belief in CBT the same thing as an encounter? Uh, it can be. So in cognitive behavioral therapy, they have terms called schemas and core beliefs. These are terms to describe essentially patterns or rules of the world that we create. Very often, these rules of the world are created early on in our life from our childhood, either because they've been taught to us from our parents or from authority figures. these rules of the world unfortunately develop before our brains are fully developed. So very often we're smart enough to know what's going on, but not smart enough to understand why. And so the brain fills in the blanks. Very often we operate from those rules for the rest of our lives without really fully investigating them or updating them, making them a little bit more accurate or at least more helpful. So what ends up happening in CBT is they can use different techniques. Aaron Beck creates something called the vertical. I think he called it the vertical descent technique, where somebody might say something and he'll ask, "Well, what would it mean if that's true?" And then he'll say, "Oh, well, then that means this." Okay, let's say that's true. What would that mean? Oh, well, then that means this. Okay, and what's that true? Eventually, you're going to get to a core belief, and that belief may not be entirely accurate or entirely helpful. But until you actually hit that floor and identify that you've been operating from an inaccurate rule of the world, one might say an unconscious rule of the world that technique made more conscious, we can update our software. We can then say, okay, well, sometimes that's true, sometimes it's not true. How can I make it more accurate? How can I make it more thoughtful? Or how can I make it more helpful while still within the realms of reality? Now they can do kind of some cognitive behavioral changes, but there is an emotional component to that. Like you are confronting all of the times that you have potentially operated from that rule, from that inaccurate or unhelpful rule of the world, and it's led to symptoms. It's led to consequences, often interpersonal consequences, abandonment, feelings of powerlessness, feelings of inadequacy. And it's through that maybe they update it, they make it more accurate, they make it more helpful, but they're also creating within themselves a capacity to be more um, authentic, more spontaneous, more creative as a human being in the life that they do have. So another long story short, is uncovering a core belief in CBT the same as an encounter? It can be. If you just bring it up, this is the problem with the worksheet or with AI therapy. You can maybe get a response and go, "Oh, neat." But if there's not an emotional component, if there's not that 2-foot drop from your intellectual, from your mind to your heart, you're probably not changing. You're probably going to go back to business as usual after the novelty of the thought wears off. There has to be an emotional component for there to be change, for there to be real integration. Um, that's very hard in absence of another person. That's probably another conversation entirely. Why do different therapy types work even though they use different methods? I mean, I feel like that's what I'm orbiting. While I may be biased and think that other therapy types are better at getting to that tension and better at resolving that tension, any approach, any theory of change that leads to that encounter is going to be therapeutic. So whether that's EMDR, whether that's cognitive behavioral therapy, empty chair technique, if you're not wrestling with anything, if therapy's fun, if you're showing up and you're having a great time, you're probably not working through anything. So at the end of the day, I don't think it really matters what the actual theory of change the therapist is operating from. What's important is that as the patient are going through that tension, and you'll know it. You'll walk away and say, I felt it. I felt like I had a good meal, or I felt like I went 5 rounds with Mike Tyson. That means you're confronting something. That means you're encountering something within you. Um, let's see. Can talking to an empty chair in therapy really do anything? Look at that. He knew that I wanted to talk about empty chair technique. Yes. This is one of those techniques that I think has not been very popular over the last few decades because it is harder to operationalize. It's harder to replicate. You can't just do a weekend workshop in empty chair technique and do it effectively. In fact, piss poor trained therapists doing empty chair technique increases the likelihood of them traumatizing their patients or re-traumatizing their patients. And I actually see this as a big problem. People will go in, they'll see empty chair technique done in a weekend workshop. I was in a conference this last week where Stephen Hayes did a psychodrama and he incorporated some empty chair techniques. And he's a much better therapist than I am, but I think that he was kind of going at some of these formal techniques a little uh, differently than I would. But the thing is that the empty chair technique is very potent. The reason for that is because the body does not know time and the mind doesn't actually have an eye. I know a lot of people say the mind's eye, but the mind's eye doesn't see through your physical eyes. If you're looking at an empty chair, but you're having a confrontation with your, let's say a grandparent passed away or a parent passed away, and you're having a conversation with your dead parent, there is going to be a moment where you're not talking to the furniture anymore. You're actually communicating from your heart to a person who's no longer with us anymore. And when this is done very well, they stop seeing the therapist. They're in an emotional connection and they'll say like, "I'm sorry I let you down," or, "We should have I wish I spent more time with you." And it's a very sincere emotional expression in those moments. Uh, there is a confrontation there. People confront their regret. They confront things that have been left unsaid. If they were harmed or traumatized by that parent, they're going to confront what was unsaid. Maybe some of the aggression, some of the anger, some of the "what I can never forgive you for" moments. And these can be very corrective emotional experiences. People who have very difficult, fears of abandonment that probably go back to conditional love in their family of origin, impacting all of their romantic relationships moving forward. They can have that conversation with their early caregiver and say, "F you for doing this to me. All of my relationships have suffered because of you. I don't want to do this anymore." And that creates the conditions for, okay, how do you want to do things differently? Or get a chair for the part of yourself that wants to be better. Get a chair for the part of yourself 5 years from now, 10 years from now, who doesn't have this issue anymore. How are you living differently? What did you do to get there? And then they're confronting that surplus reality, like, "Oh no, how did I get through this? How am I now this social, free, spontaneous person?" Yeah, empty chair technique can get into an encounter very quickly. The thing is that it's not a therapy modality for people who aren't comfortable with affect. There's going to be tears, there's going to be screaming. I have seen like the loudest, most tearful expressions using a technique like empty chair technique, but that's why it's potent. It gets to the encounter quickly and effectively. If somebody's not prepared for that, or if the encounter is with somebody who's traumatized them and the therapist is really poorly getting them to identify their with their traumatizer, uh, that can that can be really bad. So if you're watching this as a patient and you're going, "Empty chair technique, I've never heard of that. I want to get me a Gestalt therapist like Fritz Perls." Be cautious. Actually vet them effectively. Like, that is not a technique that you want done by someone who has not been appropriately supervised and trained in it. It's potent, and so if it's misused, it will potently traumatize someone. Um, how important is the therapist's personality in creating meaningful encounters? I feel like I kind of touched on that. I mentioned that there's an art and a science to psychotherapy. Part of it is also the personality fit. I have seen personality fit work. I've seen personality fit make a bad therapist into a good therapist because they went through what their patient went through, or they can think like their patient, so they just connect in a really great way. I've seen bad personality fit ruin otherwise a great therapist. I've seen people who they're very well trained, they're very technically proficient. They probably have more techniques in their repertoire than most therapists, but they just don't get the other person. They had different walks of life, or they just have an awful personality. One of my dearest colleagues is on the autism spectrum. He's actually very autistic, One of the greatest research psychologists I know, this guy does his homework. If you ask him, "Hey, what is this mechanism or what is this, psychological principle?" He will go and he will come back with one of the best literature reviews you've ever read. But you put him in a room with a patient and he's not going to vibe with them. He has a difficult time taking the perspective of the another person because of his autism, and therefore he's actually quite ineffective as a psychotherapist. So in this case, I think that personality fit is necessary for creating that meaningful connection, because again, this guy, it's he's not dumb. He's smarter than most people I know. But that one missing piece enabled in his ability to genuinely connect with and use that connection as a mechanism, as a leverage point to create that encounter, or to create space for that encounter. He just doesn't have the juice. So I would say that the therapist's personality is perhaps one of the most important aspects in creating a meaningful encounter. It's and again, this doesn't even mean that they have to be likable. That guy can be entirely unlikable, but if they're capable of making that connection and using that connection to provoke or elicit an encounter, they're going to be potent. Um, I've said this before, I'll say it again. I think that therapist fit and vibe is perhaps the single most important factor in knowing that you're even getting good therapy. And you can know that within 3 or 4 meetings of a therapist. If you go in and you go, I've been seeing him for a few months and I'm still not sure, it's a no. You'll know within 3 or 4 weeks if that therapist is able to get you into that space, is able to adequately warm you up for an emotional therapeutic encounter. What should I do if I don't feel emotionally safe with my therapist? I No one's holding a gun up to your head to make you work with the same therapist. If they're able to create the conditions for your change, they don't have to be likable. They can be crap. But if they're not making you feel safe enough to go there, even if they're saying here's the space for the encounter, and you're going, you're not warmed up enough to go there, uh, walk away. You're under no obligation to continue with that therapist. Now, it is important to do a reality check. Look very hard in the mirror. Is this the therapist? Is this the therapist who's not making me feel safe, or would I not feel safe regardless of who I work with? I've worked with 10 therapists. I haven't felt safe with all 10 of them. I left all 10 of them after 3 sessions. Maybe the common denominator is a personality trait. Maybe it is a part of yourself that is showing up in the therapy room. How am I going to phrase this? It's possible that the same things that are getting in the way of meaningful social relationships and meaningful romantic relationships will also get in the way of therapy. The difference is a good therapist will be willing to work with you and figure out, "Hey, that's weird. Let's dig into it." Versus a social relationship where they might say, "That's weird. We can't be friends anymore." So long as that therapist is willing to go, let's look at these patterns. Let's look at how you might be willing to contribute to it, instead of taking it personally, instead of saying, "Well, I can't work with you because you don't think I'm good." Um, Still, encounters can still happen. Uh, I guess what I would say is, if you don't feel emotionally safe with your therapist, that could be a fit issue. And if it's not a good fit, take the hit, sunk cost, find another therapist. Most therapists, if you tell them, "Hey, I don't think that this is a good fit. I found somebody who I think is a better fit," will say, "Good." The most important thing is that you are with the best fit and that you are taking steps to improve the issue. If there is somebody who's better at getting you there than me, I want you to connect with them. Um, a good therapist might also ask, I wonder if you jumping from therapist to therapist is something that's going on in your social life, and therefore you can still have some therapy. But if you don't feel safe, there's no law that says you need to keep working with the same therapist forever. Can a therapist be too nice? For example, they avoid necessary encounters just to be liked. Yes. And I think that's where a lot of the Rogerian person-centered therapists get stuck. They are too nice that they are not leaning when they need to lean. They're not pushing when they need to push. Uh, Rogerian person-centered therapy is a terrific approach, especially for people who are cautious, they are slower to warm, and they have a lot of suspicion as to the therapeutic process. They're given all the time in the world to come out of their shell at their own pace. The downside is that there are too many therapists who are just all about the affirmation. It's not your fault, it's your parents, it's society, it's the system, it's capitalism. You're an innocent victim in all of this. Too much of that, there's no encounter. There's nothing to wrestle with. If you're perfect and you're just a victim of your circumstances, there's nothing to wrestle with. That you just accept that, the world is out to get you and go home, maybe get some ice cream. Uh, it is important that a therapist have a little bit of that firmness. I do think it is important to balance both warmth and firmness. Unfortunately, the therapy profession tends to draw in people who are more warm than they are firm. Of course, they're healers. They're trying to create they're trying to create a career over lifting people up. The last thing they want to do is tell them that some of their problems might be their own fault. It requires some edge, it requires some degree of firmness to be able to hold the mirror against the patient and say, let's take a look at some of the darker aspects of this, or let's take a look at how you might be contributing to the degradation of your life or relationships. Uh, it requires a healthy balance of the warmth and the firmness. Now, I don't want to say that you should just be a dick as a therapist either. There is such a thing as too firm. If there's no warmth at all, if you don't think your therapist cares or gives a crap whatsoever, they're just telling you what to do or giving you advice, telling you to shape up or ship out, they're going to be limited in their effectiveness, because who wants to take advice or who wants to hear the perspective of somebody who's cruel or cold? I do think there's a perfect balance, but that might vary from clinician to clinician. I'm biased. But yes, you can absolutely have a therapist that's too warm. Is it possible to go too deep, too fast in therapy? Yes. Kind of to that point I was making earlier about a therapeutic temperature. Uh, More often than not, I think patients come in a little cold. They're if it's in the afternoon, they've maybe had their work day, they've already been awake for a while, they're used to the social contract. "Hi, how you doing?" "Great, how are you?" And you have to warm them up to get into the more emotionally charged stuff. You might ask about things that have caused, pain in the last week, or unresolved fights or unresolved arguments. And it takes time to get there. Usually around 10, 15 minutes into the therapeutic hour, they're in it. They're like, "Oh no, this is what it was like to have an argument, or this is what it was like to fail or to mess up or to feel abandoned or to feel inadequate, impotent," whatever it might be. And then the encounter can start, and that's where the mechanisms of change are. But if you're coming in hot, like maybe they just were fired or they were just dumped, they were just diagnosed with a terminal illness, the therapy session can start and you can see it on their face. They're hot, like they're energized, they're ready to go. They might even say, "I have so much to talk about. It's this, it's this, it's this, it's this." It's actually important for the therapist to slow them down a little bit. It's not uncommon for them to jump topic to topic to topic to topic. You might want to slow them down or say, "Hey, we're going by too quickly. Which one of these can we focus on?" And put the magnifying glass on. And just being able to choose that, you see them slow down a little bit, and they're at a more tolerable therapeutic temperature to manage some of these issues. Um, so yeah, I do think that it can go too hot too fast, and it's the therapist's responsibility to lower the therapeutic temperature into that sweet spot. just as it's common for people to come in cold and it's the therapist's responsibility to warm them up into that sweet spot, that ideal therapeutic cooking temperature. Um, can you grow from therapy even if you never talk about the big stuff? Um, yes. Um, I'm gonna pick on cognitive behavioral therapy, the brief manualized treatment modalities. I don't particularly think that those often tackle the big stuff. It's usually surface level stuff. These are the symptoms that I'm wrestling with, or here's the problem that I'm having today. Uh, there is a benefit to that. Um, I think most people want to have their whole person treated. Very few people come to therapy with a specific individual time limited problem like CBT offers solutions for. But that doesn't mean it's useless. In fact, some people just need a little bit of psychoeducation, or they need the worksheet of the skill just to challenge their thought. And they need to do it 3 or 4 times before they know how to do it without a worksheet. And all they need is to do the reps. If you just move somebody by 1, 2, or 3 degrees, that tiny difference over time can be pretty huge. And that is what all some people need. I have the one skill, or I had the one piece of knowledge that I was missing. I'm ready to go, or I'm ready to move with my own skills and abilities. I don't want to poo-poo that. I think there's more. Therapy can certainly go further. But even one therapy session with one good therapist who can get you into that encounter and have that friction and you walk away, like, that is good enough. Like, that you have experienced therapy. Um, I'm a little biased. I'm into the more open-ended, ongoing developmental psychotherapy even as a patient. I don't think that I've met criteria for a diagnosable mental illness for maybe 15, 20 years now. But if my therapist can get me into that space, I'm growing, I'm developing, I'm maturing. And I think the more of that I do, just the more whole and deep a person I'm becoming. That's my own personal bias. Not everybody agrees with me, but honestly, I like the deep stuff. I have not I have not hit a point in my life where I'm getting diminished returns from a good therapist that can make me confront and have that encounter. Um, let's see. What if I want both deep emotional work and practical tools? Hey, I'm for it. I know some people who are very rigid psychoanalytic, like pure psychoanalytic psychotherapists, where they just do transference focused psychotherapy. They sit back and they listen. They barely say anything at all. They're great at it, but honestly, I think the best therapists have at least some behavioral element, some change focus to it. Even if it's just, hey, over the next week, think about what you can do differently. That is enough of an invitation to do things differently. That is just enough of an invitation to change that it meets the bare minimum for a practical tool, in my opinion. Some people like worksheets, some people like specifically, hey, do this way, this many times. um, there's benefit to it. I think it needs to be tempered with the drawing board. Not all things are going to work well. Not all things are going to work well for every person. But if you have 10 skills, try each of them. Maybe 3 of them are going to work well, 3 of them aren't going to work at all. But find the 3 that work for yourself. Bam, that's useful. Use those 3 as much as possible. I just don't think that's enough. If advice was enough for a person, uh, the self-help industry, people would only buy one self-help book and they'd all be cured. It doesn't work that way. Unfortunately, it is a bit of a fallacy that if people knew better, that they would do better. I honestly wish that everyone would get 12 weeks of just radical behaviorism first before they did any other therapy. Just here's radical behaviorism, do this differently over and over again, and you will eliminate what you think the problem is. And once and it's accurate, right? You want to get rid of panic attacks in 12 weeks? Great. Here's CBT for panic attacks. No more panic attacks after 12 weeks. The thing is that even though they may never have a panic attack again, the absence of the panic attacks will now open up a whole new can of worms of desires, of aspirations, of goals, of, open tensions, of unresolved relational, disputes or difficulty with interpersonal skills in general. And it really is after what they think the presenting problem is gone that they go, oh, now I think it's more than that, or I realize it's deeper than that. Great. In many ways, that's when therapy begins. But too many people do it completely in absence of skills, tools, and techniques. And those are useful. But what's most useful is to just teach the drawing board. You can go on Google. You can go on ChatGPT. What's 10 strategies or behaviors or skills that I can use? That's not enough. That's often not enough for motivation and momentum. Well, I hit my hour quota. Typically, the format of this show is an hour of discussion and then 30 minutes of Q&A. But I have been approaching this entire episode as if it were a Q&A. I'm thinking this is probably good for now. I'm curious how I can improve this. When I don't have a second person, when I don't have a co-host, I am sort of just winging it. If you have any suggestions or improvements or directions you would like to see this show, comment. Give us any suggestions, give us any questions or concerns. Like, follow, support us, do what you can. The more you like, the more you comment, the more you subscribe, the more shows we put out. The more feedback you give us, the better the show gets. My name is Dr. Edward Perin. Hope to see you next week. Take care.